everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I am your host, Muriel, and in this video, I will be laying out my reading idiosyncrasies, or at least most of them, and what I like to call my personal reading ethics. Both because I figured I might as well have all of them in one neat little place for future referencing, and specifically with regards to the latter, in reaction to discourse I've encountered over the past 5 years or so I've been doing booktube and engaging with broader literary spaces online. I will start with my reading idiosyncrasies and, well, what will essentially amount to a kind of new and improved introduction to me as a reader and reviewer of literature, principally, and other forms of art and media to a lesser extent. So, once again, hello and welcome. My name is Muriel and I am a proud bookworm with a Y in the worm. The name of my channel is The Purple Bookworm. Why is that, you may ask? Well, it's because I love dragons and most other mythological or fantastical creatures for one thing, and more importantly, SFF literature for another. Indeed, that is what I read the most of. Speculative fiction. So fantasy, science fiction, dystopian, or post-apocalyptic literature, bits of horror here and there as well, on its own or more often mixed in with the former subgenres, the occasional bit of alternative history, etc., but not, as a general rule, magical realism. That subgenre just doesn't really agree with me. That being said, I also read general fiction from time to time, and I also read nonfiction about various topics that interest me, like feminism, mythology, I'm a huge freaking mythology nerd, things like ancient pagan religions, or spirituality, and then STEM, more specifically biology, zoology, botany, etc., and then books that look at the intersection of some of these topics as well. Now, most readers tend to describe themselves as being either plot or character-driven, or I suppose they could be both, but I am what I like to call a concepts or ideas-driven reader. I am primarily motivated by world-building and theming when it comes to speculative fiction, or just theming in the case of general fiction. However, that doesn't mean I don't value good character work or plot. Fiction literature, after all, for me, is a storytelling art form. I do want to learn things on different levels when I engage with art, but the learning, the theming, should ideally be seamlessly woven into the art itself, and so into the story itself when it comes to fiction literature. I don't want to read a textbook or a manifesto when I pick up a novel, basically, but I do want my fiction to feel meaningful, stimulating, elevating, you get the gist. Which then brings me to what I like to call my hierarchy of literary needs. As a concepts and ideas-driven reader, when I read a novel, I primarily want to be stimulated on an intellectual, an imaginative, and, hopefully in concert with that, an emotional level, through theming and world-building to a slightly lesser extent. In essence, if a book moves my heart, stimulates my mind, and, dare I say, elevates my spirit, if it hits that rare trifecta, chances are it will become a new all-time favorite. Then comes plot. I want, ideally, engaging stories that keep me moving through them, though that doesn't necessarily mean fast-paced stories either, to be clear. Some of my all-time favorites are slower stories. Then comes characters, and perhaps on more or less the same level, prose or writing style. As to the latter specifically, I do love beautiful prose, what I perceive to be beautiful prose. Writing that just stimulates my mind on a vibratory level. Yes, I have this whole thing about the frequencies and rhythms within writing, storytelling, and how those interact differently with different people's brains, but that's a discussion for another day, maybe. But anyway, yes, it is through prose that we tell written stories, of course, but I can still enjoy a novel even if the form of its storytelling isn't straightforwardly beautiful or lyrical. If it employs very utilitarian prose, but the content it's conveying is just great on an intellectual and or emotional level. An example of this for me would, well, be Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Time duology. The fact I'm a very good visualizer, that I basically see movies, or rather what I conceptualize as waking dreams when I read in my head, probably has a lot to do with this as well. When it comes to general fiction, however, things are a bit different, given world building isn't a factor at all. Theming remains at the top of the hierarchy, yes, but given a lot of it is done through character work and character psychology, or at least that's been the case in the general fiction I've enjoyed, characters then become a lot more important for me in general fiction literature. And the same kind of goes with prose. With speculative literature, I feel like good to great theming and world building compensate a lot for average prose and or character work in a way that I just don't really find applicable when it comes to general fiction. So I'm not a character-driven reader, but nor do I easily relate to characters in fiction. In fact, it's a pretty rare occurrence for me. Maybe it's partly due to the good autism, for all I know. After all, I've often felt very different from people around me, and alienated, unfortunately, in real life, and I guess that just carries over into fiction for me. But that's fine, because I don't need to relate to a character or characters to enjoy a story, so yay for me. To be clear though, that doesn't mean I can't empathize with characters in books, because I can and do, and I'm often perfectly content just finding characters interesting from a more detached human psychology point of view. It's also a bit more common for me to encounter characters I can partially relate to on the basis of a shared life experience, but actually finding characters I feel are significantly similar to me as a person is pretty rare. It's a really nice feeling when it does happen, though. When it comes to rating the books I read and review, I use a 10-point rating scale. Yes, I essentially lifted straight out of my school days. Although in university we use a 20 points rating scale, so there you go. On a practical level, this means a 5 out of 10 is the average. If a book scores a 5, it is mediocre. It is not good, but it's not bad with a capital B either. It just barely passed the minimum requirements of okay. Anything below that is bad. A 3.5 to 5 book is bad, but not necessarily offensively so, or it had some redeeming qualities. Anything below that is very bad to abject garbage, which is, very, very bad. Though I don't think I've ever rated something with a 0, so I guess that means I'm always able to find at least one decent thing in a book, a little silver lining, even when it's trash otherwise. Interestingly enough, when I go above a 5 out of 10, there are actually more nuances to my rating system. A book that scores above a 5 and up to a 6 is just above average, which means it was alright, but definitely not worth my time. If a book scores between a 6 and a 7, that means it was, at the very least, worth reading once, and I will generally not regret having picked it up. It will have been decent to somewhat good, but scoring a 7 is when it actually starts to be properly good, and when it enters that space where I just might reread it someday. There's no guarantee, but I just might consider reading it again 10 years down the line to see if my thoughts and feelings about it have changed. An example of this for me would be something like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. If a book scores a 7.5, it is very good. I wish I could have a 7.5 out of 10 rating average for my reading as a whole. Hell, I'd even take a 7 out of 10 average rating at this point. 7.5 is also the point at which general fiction novels can become new top 10 favorites for me. The Enchanted, written by Renee Denfeld, or say Jane Eyre, written by Charlotte Bronte, for instance, are two such novels. Whereas for SFF, speculative literature, that's an 8 out of 10. When a book scores an 8, it's very, very good to great, and will automatically get a reread at some point. So 7 is where a book might get reread, 8 is where it will automatically be reread, even if it takes me 15 years to do so. 9 means a book was excellent, and 10 means it was perfect. For me, I don't believe in objective or absolute perfection, but on a subjective or relative level, yes, 10 out of 10 read means perfection. So for me, that includes Lolita written by Vladimir Nabokov, The Handmaid's Tale written by Margaret Atwood, The Left Hand of Darkness written by Ursula K. Le Guin, The Mists of Avalon written by Marion Zimmer Bradley, Hollow Kingdom written by Kira Jane Buxton, Elder Race written by Adrian Tchaikovsky, The Southern Reach trilogy, or at the very least Annihilation written by Jeff Vandermeer, and maybe George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, with reservations there, given it is, sadly, an unfinished series. And yeah, scoring a 10 out of 10 is obviously very rare. If a book does that, it basically becomes a new top all-time favorite across all genres. Now I'll go over a few miscellaneous items, mostly because my thinking about them has changed while doing BookTube and engaging with a broader reading community. Doing BookTube and systematically writing reviews on Goodreads has made me more critical and analytical as a reader. I mean, I've always been a fairly critical and analytical reader. I think it's fun to do so. That's part of the reason why I decided to do BookTube and company in the first place, but that part of me as a reader has only grown since then. So first up is the hard v soft science fiction dichotomy. Most science fiction readers divide books into hard or soft science fiction. I used to do so myself, and as far as I can tell, there are two ways of understanding this dichotomy. First is to see hard sci-fi as sci-fi that is rooted in solid-ish scientific data or knowledge, and that extrapolates from that in as realistic a way as possible, and to see soft sci-fi as sci-fi that plays faster and looser with what is considered scientifically plausible, and that prioritizes the cool factor. The second way to view this dichotomy, to my mind, is to consider hard sci-fi, sci-fi that centers on the harder branches of science, or STEM. So physics, chemistry, engineering, and, well, not so much mathematics, but I guess biology. Though there is that whole thing where biology gets dunked on by the other branches of STEM in academia. It's a whole thing, but let's move on. And to then consider soft sci-fi, sci-fi that centers on the softer branches of science, such as psychology, sociology, anthropology, etc. Something which Ursula K. Le Guin, for instance, excelled at. I used to subscribe to the latter version of this dichotomy, but now reject it entirely, and have done so since finishing Peter Watt's Blindsight. Because, unfortunately, I noticed a discomforting pattern with this dichotomy in hard or harder sci-fi spaces which, no offense, tend to be male-dominated, or if not male-dominated as such, tend to be populated with pretty vocal, what I like to call lit bros. And this discomforting pattern is one of bro-ish superiority that tends to conflate the usage of especially hard physics jargon, for instance, and edgy nihilistic theming with superior intelligence and depth. You know, the kind of people who think that not liking Rick and Morty means you're an idiot. Which then sadly also overlaps with not great attitudes of the sexist, misogynistic et al. Persuasion. And I'm just done with that. I'm very done. As a quick FYI, it's also because of this stuff that I no longer use the label of genius to refer to individuals. So I've moved on to a different and more fluid pseudo-dichotomy. I will either label sci-fi, and also fantasy in its own way, as being ideas-driven, just very committed to its themes and concepts, entertainment-driven, where it's, you know, more about its popcorn fun factor, or a mix of both. So Dune or The Left Hand of Darkness would be examples of the first category, the Kaiju Preservation Society would be an example of the second, and I guess something like Alistair Reynolds' Revelation Space would be, for me, an example of the third category. I thought it was more about the popcorn factor than anything else, but it also does commit to theming on the Fermi paradox, so I'll give it that. And to be clear, I'm not throwing any shade to entertainment-driven fiction. I'm an ideas and concepts-driven reader. Yes, but that doesn't mean I think that makes me superior to anyone else, or that I think there's anything wrong with a story that primarily or exclusively aims to entertain. Like, I love the Kaiju Preservation Society myself, for what it was, as a reminder. A few words about sexual violence in fiction, given this is very topical, given we live in a society, and given I myself am a victim of sexual violence, including 2.5, I know what I mean, counts of child sexual abuse, with grooming, rape, etc., and 1 count of emotional abuse as an adult. I'm also, if you hadn't noticed, a female human being and have experienced my decent share of sexism, misogyny, etc. I used to be a lot more tolerant of sexually violent content in my fiction, but am now a lot more selective when it comes to reading books that feature sexual violence, or rather gratuitous sexual violence. My breaking point of sorts came last year when I read William Gibson's Neuromancer. It's not even the worst I've read when it comes to this, looking at you, Magician King, which I otherwise loved. Anyway, and I decided enough was enough for the sake of my mental health and, comfort. I'm thus now actively filtering out books that, to the best of my knowledge, will feature gratuitous sexual violence in the world building, sure, but more crucially in the character crafting and development of their mostly female characters. Double whammy if it's in the service of a male character's arc. And once again, no offense, but I've mostly seen this done by male authors with female characters. Though female writers can absolutely mishandle sexual violence in their stories and be gratuitous with their sexual content. Yes, looking at you, Anne McCaffrey, or Ghost at least. Or E.L. James, I suppose, but that's the lowest of low-hanging fruit. To be clear though, and I will expand upon this in my section on reading ethics, I don't think including badly handled sexual or sexually violent content in your fiction automatically makes you a bad person, or that you should be cancelled for it, or that it means your books don't have any good qualities besides that. I actually wager a lot of male and some female authors do this stuff without any malicious intent, or even fully realizing what it is they're participating in. Because, well, gendered socialization is complex, because societal misogyny, racism, homophobia, etc. are complex phenomena that you cannot, most of the time, reduce to simplistic black and white propositions. Of course, even I have my limits with that, right? But my point is, I don't think you're evil for having a problematic element in your fiction. I would just, rather avoid badly handled sexual and sexually violent content in my fiction moving forward for my own healing and peace of mind. As an ideas and concepts-driven reader, what are some ideas or other themes I enjoy in fiction? Well, I love properly feminist theming, and I do mean properly feminist theming. Not the woke marketing bait drivel I see promoted way too often these days. I also generally enjoy theming on nature, the relationship human beings have with nature, and non-human animals more specifically. As a pantheist, I also love when spirituality is injected into all of that. Hence my love of Hollow Kingdom or the Mists of Avalon, for instance. I enjoy love, not romance. Love as a theme as well. You can also throw in explorations of trauma, or rather overcoming trauma, though that can be risky and triggering as well. And then less specifically, I just tend to enjoy when a book explores a nerdy concept or idea that touches upon a topic I find interesting, such as neuroscience, evolution, the nature of reality, dreams, different states of consciousness, etc. China Mieville is one of my favorite authors. Embassy Town, for instance, explores the concept of linguistic relativity and linguistic cognition in a way I found insanely intellectually stimulating, and it had freaking super cool aliens to boot. And Daniel Keyes' Flowers for Algernon, for its part, really went ham with exploring the consequences of artificially augmenting a person's cognitive abilities or intelligence in a way I found very thoughtful and moving. On the more negative side of things, I tend to be very wary of time travel in my fiction, because most of the time I just don't think it's handled well at all. In fact, it tends to hurt my brain, most definitely in a bad way. I also hate uncritically positively portrayed hive minds or uber communalistic societies. I'm just too much of my own person, too much of an individuationist, and autistic, I guess, maybe, all that shit. I also get annoyed when I feel like a story is making me root for humanity just a little too much. I love nature. I'm a pantheist. And I certainly have my qualms with my own species as a group, but I don't hate humanity. I don't hate being a Homo sapiens. I mean, I don't always feel human, but that's a separate, isn't it fun to be neurodivergent issue. I don't think we humans are superior to every other life form on Earth, and I loathe human supremacism and exceptionalism in fiction and in real life, but I don't think we are inferior to all other life forms on Earth either. And so I don't like stories that indulge in overcorrecting environmental theming that centers on human self-hatred. That's why I always say, if you make me root for humanity this hard, you're doing something wrong. I'm all about that balance. Then I'd be remiss not to mention my hatred of what I'll oversimplistically term nihilism porn and edginess for the sake of it. I'm just not about that. I'm not a nihilist. Not saying there's anything wrong with being a nihilist, and yes, I'm aware there are different branches of philosophical nihilism as well, but as it stands, I don't like it and would rather not encounter it in my fiction. Finally, for now at least, we have the subject of romance. I don't like romance, but I can enjoy love stories. I differentiate quite sharply between the two. Now, putting aside the fact I don't even like the word romance, nor even the concept of romantic love, outside of references to the actual romantic movement, I don't like romances because they tend to focus on insta-lust, misunderstood as insta-love, at worst, and rapid-fire infatuation at best. For one thing, I don't believe insta-love exists, period. For another, I just cannot relate to lightning-quick infatuation or insta-lust, though I mind that a lot less if it is in fact acknowledged as insta-lust. It's not something I experience because I'm demisexual, but I can understand it conceptually. Pretending that is the same thing as love, though, that really bugs me. I find it kind of gross, actually, to each their own, because love is something very serious and meaningful to me, and I also just find it incredibly tedious to waste precious page time on muppety, pointless romances between characters that aren't actually based in anything substantive, like respect, actually liking one another, friendship, etc. But real love stories that develop organically over time and are rooted in friendship, yes, give me more of those, and also give me more and better representation for genuine platonic love between both same-sex and opposite-sex friends. Show me characters who aren't afraid of telling their bestie that they love them, as a friend, as a brother, a sister, what have you. Please and thank you. I am now going to move on to my personal reading ethics, principally in relation to two key concepts, that of death of the author and authorial intent, and that of the separation of art from the artist. To start, I will actually mention an additional reading idiosyncrasy of mine and bounce off of that. I only very rarely have favorite authors, favorite singers, favorite painters, etc. A writer, an artist, what have you, to become a favorite of mine, I need to have liked or loved all or the vast majority of their work. Because the work of art, or piece of media, and my relationship to it come before everything else. Again, I don't know if this is because I'm autistic or if it's simply the way I am naturally. It's probably a bit of both. But I just do not care about writers, artists as people when I consume, when I engage with their creations. I don't think of them. I don't look them up before I engage with their art, and only occasionally do so after I've engaged with their art. I don't really fantasize about meeting them. I don't delude myself into thinking I know them as people. I don't demonize them. I don't put them on pedestals, because I just do not care when it comes to my relationship with their creations. I will, of course, extend basic human respect and compassion towards artists as fellow human beings and as fellow artists. And yes, I can have immense respect and or appreciation for the fact another human being created a work of art I love. But my attitude is basically the following. Hey, you, Creator X, thank you for making that awesome work of art, literature, what have you. I freaking adored it. It was beautiful, super meaningful, etc. Okay, have a nice day, bye. And that's it for me. Now sure, anecdote time. A few months ago, I wrote a message to author Kira Jane Buxton to express how much I loved Hollow Kingdom. And, I just wanted to do something nice. And I got a lovely response from her, so shout out to her. That was a genuinely nice experience. Why? Because it was simply a very pleasant human interaction, and I was just glad I'd made someone's day better by thanking them for making a work of art I loved. But I didn't gush over this human being, right? I didn't ever once lose sight of the fact this is essentially a stranger whom I don't actually know and whose personal opinions are pretty much irrelevant to the fact I love their creation. Even with favorite authors like Ursula K. Le Guin or China Miéville or Jeff Vandermeer, my appreciation of their work never bleeds into an appreciation of the human being beyond a desire to, I don't know, have a chat for an hour. Because it seems, to me, based on their works of art, or non-fiction in the case of late Ms. Le Guin, or interviews I've read, like they are, or were, interesting people, with minds I respect, at a distance in any case, with interesting things to say and share. So picking those kinds of people's brains for an hour would probably be a lot of fun. But I'm under no illusion I know these individuals, that they're my friends, or heroes, what have you. The only hero I have is my own mother, not some stranger, thank you very much. Yes, I did shed a few tears when Ursula K. Le Guin died, because I had, and still have, a lot of respect for her as an artist, and I felt sad such a brilliantly creative spirit had passed from this world, and that we would no longer get novels written by her. Novels which are extremely meaningful to me. But, it lasted all of a couple of minutes, and it's very much the exception that proves my rule. So when I engage with a work of art, or with a piece of media, I very literally, very directly consider it before anything else on its own merits and through the lens of my own person. Now, of course, there are nuances to all of this, which I will now develop in relation to the concepts of death of the author and the separation of art from the artist, and the separation of both from the art consumer, but I'll get back to that. Death of the author. Now, before anything else, I want to state that yes, I am aware that within academic discourse, and as first put forward by Roland Barthes himself, the meaning of death of the author is somewhat narrower than it is in colloquial discourse. At least that's my understanding. It principally refers to the idea that an artist's intent cannot be taken as the only or last word on the interpretation of a work of art they have produced, but not that it's irrelevant or that any reader's or critic's interpretation just goes. For my part, I don't think an author's intent is irrelevant in the absolute, but the fact is no, I don't care about it ultimately when I personally, once again, interact with and interpret a work of art, literature, etc. So yes, I am very pro-death of the author as a concept and a framework for artistic analysis, and generally don't really care about authorial intent when making sense of a work of art, or rather more specifically, a work of literature. I'm mostly going to say literature from now on, but my thoughts apply to art and media in general. Because it all goes back to the fact I just naturally don't think of and don't care about artists, writers, etc. when it comes to my relationship with and my interpretation of a work of art, a piece of media. This is also partly informed by my own knowledge of the artistic, creative process as an amateur artist, as a creative person. I draw, I play the piano, I write to some extent, if only for BookTube and Goodreads, though I kind of hope to write fiction someday as well. And the fact is, there isn't always, or even most of the time, I'd argue, a one-to-one relationship in terms of meaning psychological expression, portrayal of values, etc., between a work of art and its artist. Now, sure, it's a little harder to hide oneself when writing a novel, I suppose, given the more explicit nature of prose storytelling. But still, as an artist, yes, you can, if you want to, pour the depths of your soul, mind, heart, whatever you want to call it, into your art in a more literal or a more symbolic fashion, depending on the art form. But you can also just explore an idea, an aesthetic, for pure shits and giggles, as practice, as an exercise in style, or simply because you're interested in writing, painting, composing music about a specific theme, a specific emotion, a specific experience. Maybe you want to explore a psyche completely different from your own in fiction, and sometimes thereby discover something about yourself you previously didn't fully know, acknowledge, understand. There's so many reasons to create art. And now, sure, writing about a certain topic because you are interested in it does say something about you as a person. It says something about your interests. But it's not necessarily some radical revelation about your deep nature as a human being, about your values, your ideology, etc. Art, as a phenomenon, as a passion, as a way of being even, is so much more beautifully layered and variegated than that. So that's one thing. Another is that art, once it is shared with the rest of humanity, that is my belief, no longer solely belongs to its artist. And to be clear, I'm not talking about intellectual property rights here, that's something else. But that, to me, is a facet of the social contract, of being a social communal animal that you cannot escape. It's, in a very specific way, kind of like having children, at the risk of pulling out a very old cliche, I'm aware. Once a child is born, it is its own person, right? And you have to start letting go of it. Even though you love your child and have literally poured some of your own DNA, flesh and blood, into it. Similarly, once you release a work of art into the wider world to be shared with others, its meaning is no longer exclusively yours to determine. I myself am fully aware that if I were to publish fiction someday, I would no longer be the sole determinator of its meaning, its messages, even though I would most certainly write fiction with specific theming in mind. But that's okay, I accept that. Honestly, the dynamic interplay and divide between the meaning an artist injects into their art, insofar as they do, and the meaning an art consumer extracts from said art is, in my book, part of its magic and beauty. I think it's a wonderful thing. Now, making art just for yourself, to express yourself, your feelings, your thoughts, your relationship to the world outside of other human beings, etc., that has value too, absolutely. Both modes of art have value and magic to them. They're simply doing different things. Does that mean authorial intent, or rather authorial context, so the personal history of a writer, the societal and historical contexts they grew up in and with, non-fiction writings they may have left for posterity in the case of writers that have integrated the historical literary canon, and so on and so forth. Does none of that ever matter? Is none of that ever relevant? No, of course not. That's not what I'm saying either. I do think that stuff is relevant in specific contexts, most notably academic analysis or analyses performed when looking at the broader history of literature, of art, or when looking at, say, the relationship between art and society. But when it comes to reading on, again, a personal level, or even reading as an amateur critic, reviewer, as someone who does literary artistic media analysis for fun, seriously, but still for fun, ultimately, no, I don't think it matters much, if at all. Again, it is interesting from a broader sociology of art point of view, if you will, or at the very least a history of art point of view. Yes, but not really when it comes to just evaluating a work on its own merits. I keep coming back to this, but that's what matters to me. Now, sometimes the meaning I get out of a novel will, in fact, align with what the author was going for in terms of theming or emotionality. But I see that as a happy accident more than anything else. I mean, it can also be a mark of artistry, of craftsmanship, right? But it's hard to prove in a way unless you have unfettered access to writer's brain, their non-fiction writings, like I said, or DMs, I guess. So I take it as a happy accident when it does happen, most of the time. There are, of course, exceptions, times when you can, in fact, ascertain that the theming you got out of a book and loved was intended by its author. When that happens, I guess, I simply think to myself, bravo, job well done, 2 thumbs up, high five. But it's not something I need, if that makes sense. And when the meaning I get out of a book doesn't particularly reflect anything the author originally intended, well, that's basically on me, whether in a positive or a negative sense. If I love a book, I love the book, not the author. If I hate a book, I hate the book, not the author. This, however, to be clear, doesn't apply to non-fiction writing, but non-fiction isn't part of the discussion as far as I'm concerned. Which then brings me to separating the art from the artist, or, not being able to do so. This, as far as I can tell, takes 2 principal forms, so not being able to do so. Form A, some readers project their understanding, their interpretation of a book, back onto its author, and thereby make assumptions about the author's values, ideology, moral character, usually in a negative fashion, but the fact adulation exists as a phenomenon shows this exists in a positive, but no less profoundly, in my opinion, unhealthy fashion. I'll come back to this. And Form B, some readers who encounter a questionable or damning statement, a bad take, proof of bad or at least incompatible moral values, or more rarely and unfortunately proof of morally reprehensible behavior on the part of an author, will consequently deem the entirety of said author's works at best off limits, at worst morally tainted. And I would argue there is a third facet to this involving the art consumer, but I will come back to it at the end of this section. Regarding Form A, well, given my stance when it comes to authorial intent and death of the author, I generally feel very uncomfortable when people transmute their dislike of a problematic or perceived to be problematic element in a book into an assessment of the moral quality of its writer. It is, as far as I'm concerned, a variation on armchair psychologizing, and I'm just really not about that personally. Because of my understanding of the artistic process, which I covered, because I also just don't really care about authors when I engage with their works, like I covered, and because I subscribe to death of the author and don't think one can reliably assess a writer's true, much less full character based on their fiction writing alone, and certainly not based on a single work of literature. I'll concede I don't think it's entirely unreasonable to make an educated but tentative guess as to facets of a writer's personality, values, beliefs, if one assesses the entirety of their work. I myself have kind of done that to a very small extent. But even then, what I make out of that is an opinion. I'm especially thinking of dead writers here who are no longer able to defend themselves, and it's not like I feel particularly strongly about speaking ill of the dead, but I do think the vast majority of human beings are entitled to basic respect and receiving at the very least the benefit of the doubt. So blithely making assertions, especially negative assertions, about dead writers, again based on their works, it's different if you're making a case based on letters, speeches, actual interviews and whatnot, of course, but if you're exclusively making a case based on the fiction produced by a writer, well, it's a bit easy, isn't it? And it's nothing, once again, but an opinion. It may be an informed opinion, an educated guess, like I said, but you cannot, in good faith at least, state that opinion as a controvertible fact. I'm saying this very specifically because I very recently watched a video that did this in relation to Vladimir Nabokov and pedophilia. And I found it extremely intellectually dishonest. Also, just so we're all on the same page here, if you do this with living writers and artists, again, solely based on their art, not, concrete evidence of actual wrongdoing, because again, I'm focusing on assertions about negative moral character or even criminal acts here, that's slander at best, defamation at worst, which is illegal, as a friendly reminder. The beauty for me of Death of the Author, separating the art from the artist, and the fact I just apparently naturally don't really give a shit about artists when engaging with their art, is that it protects me from what I see as, bonkers, puritanical, moralizing, virtue-signaling behavior that seeks to demonize artists based on personal interpretations of art. Again, let's be clear, I'm not talking about something like shedding light on actual evidenced criminal acts, right? And then it also protects me from its positive counterpart, adulation. Adulation is a human phenomenon I just fundamentally don't get. I have never experienced it myself, and I think it is violently unhealthy, and it creeps me the fuck out. This hero worship, it's even more than that in a way, of celebrities, artists, creators, that is the kind of behavior I can understand coming from an immature 7-year-old, and no shade to children here. It's normal for a child to be immature, but it is something you have to grow out of, ideally, if you want to become a mature adult. It should be bleedingly obvious, right? But human beings are not gods. Sure, I'm a pantheist, so I believe the divine creative essence and spirit is in everything. But that doesn't mean I think everything or everyone is literally a god in the Abrahamic sense, right? Or even in the polytheistic sense. Worshipping individuals creeps me the fuck out, and here's an extra spicy take for you all. I kind of think adulating people low-key dehumanizes or at least objectifies them as well. Because when you place someone on a pedestal, you are in fact denying their full, flawed humanity. Like, it's just weird and creepy and so freaking unhealthy. I'm sorry, that's what I believe. Don't make heroes out of the artists you enjoy. I'm not saying you have to take it to the detached extreme I do. And once again, to be extra clear, just because I don't care about artists when I engage with their works doesn't mean I don't, respect them as artists and as human beings to, the basic extent. Recall what I said about writing to Kira Jane Buxton's, for instance, to say thanks for writing Hollow Kingdom. Like, if you want to have friendly interactions with writers, do so. Create, fan promotion groups for them if you want. I think that's a thing. Write to them, have pleasant human interactions, but don't adulate them. Don't delude yourself into thinking they are perfect, idols to be worshipped, then demonized when they fuck up because they are in fact human. Which then brings me to the other major facet of not being able to separate art from the artist. That which involves personally choosing to blacklist a writer's works when you discover or deem they are not a good person, or at the very least not a person you agree with when it comes to moral values, ideology, beliefs, etc. This is pretty much the inverse of what I just covered, but here again, this is not a problem for me, because of everything I already said. I assess works of literature at the risk of repeating myself on their own merits before anything else. So what if Dan Simmons votes right-wing? And so far as that is actually the case, I'm not entirely sure, don't quote me on that. Either way, I still loved Hyperion. So what if Lovecraft was a raging racist? Although, you know what, everyone conveniently forgets he apparently chilled out on some of that later in his life. No, I don't think he gets a cookie for being less hateful, but I hate that people are apparently not allowed to change, grow, and learn from their mistakes anymore, if social media is to be believed at any rate, but that's a debate for another day. So yes, so what if Lovecraft hated, or rather was terrified of, anyone who wasn't a wasp? A, bruv be fucking dead. Buried, his bones are probably rotted to nothing by now, given it's been almost a century. B, I can still enjoy the big tentacled oozy monsters he created, and admire the near-perfect way bruv portrayed alienation. Kudos. Now, sure, there are some unsavory, xenophobic, and racist elements in some, not all, some of his stories, but I can easily disregard them in favor of the tentacled cosmic horror fest. Because, pro tip, some of us can, in fact, enjoy things that have problematic elements in them as well. I don't personally subscribe to Melisandre Vachai's philosophy that Just because there's a spot of mold on an onion, you should chuck it wholesale in the bin. What about when a writer actually does something very wrong? Evil, even. Like Marion Zimmer Bradley, who, as far as the evidence points towards, raped her own child and aided and abetted her husband in the raping of boys. Here again, respectfully, I don't really care. Yes, of course, I find it upsetting and disappointing, I guess, that my favorite standalone fantasy novel of all time was, mind-bogglingly, honestly, written by a child rapist. And as a fellow victim, I wish her child and her husband's victims nothing but healing and a happy, peaceful life. But The Mists of Avalon, the actual novel, doesn't tell me to go out and rape children, or that child abuse is okay. It just doesn't enter into the equation at all for me. I was never a fan of Marion Zimmer Bradley. I never knew anything about her really when I read Mists for the first time, and when I read the other books in the Avalonian series. And when I reread Mists a few years ago, or a couple of years ago, I didn't see or feel any taint in the book itself, despite the fact I knew by that point its author had committed, yes, a truly evil act. But no, my appreciation of the book was completely unaffected. What about living writers? Well, I evaluate this stuff on a case-by-case, or rather work-by-work basis. I will still, always, if I actually read it, assess a work of fiction on its own merits before anything else. That being said, I don't think it is unreasonable to not want to pay a writer, for instance, if you believe they hold morally objectionable views. Although I may not necessarily do so myself, or if they've actually committed a morally abhorrent act. That is probably the one instance where I would hesitate to read a book. I would think long and hard about reading a book written by someone still living, convicted of, say, raping a child. It wouldn't be an automatic no, though, but I would have a long and hard think about it, yes. I would definitely not buy the book, but that's where the wonder of libraries and secondhand bookstores and other things comes in. Let's be clear, though, that's for committing an actual crime, not, having a spicy take on Twitter. Which finally brings me to my last major point. We talk a lot about separating the art from the artist, but I think we also need to talk about separating the art and artist from the art consumer, because that's the crux of the issue for me when it comes to discussing art and media with others in broader society, offline and online, because don't kid yourselves, there isn't a complete disconnection between offline and online spheres, right? Since, people commenting, talking online are still real flesh and blood people who presumably believe what they say online. At least that's my case. Everything I just shared are my personal reading ethics. Anyone is free to disagree with me and do things differently. If you don't want to read something because its author said something you disagree with on a deep moral level, that is entirely your right, and I will happily respect your boundary. If you read a book you deem to be problematic and never want to interact with its author because you believe the author is as problematic as their book, I may disagree, but that is your right, and I will respect your boundary, as long as, don't do anything morally reprehensible or illegal in turn, like harassment or defamation. What I will never respect, however, is readers telling other readers they are morally repugnant for their own reading choices and judging them guilty by association for those reading choices, and just that, without actually knowing the person. You don't want to read Lovecraft because racism. That is your right. But don't come and tell me I'm racist because I enjoy giant tentacled oozy monsters. You don't want to read Dan Simmons because you don't like his politics. That is your right. But don't come and tell me I'm a right-wing bigot for enjoying Hyperion or The Terror, especially since I'm broadly a leftist. You don't want to read The Mists of Avalon because you simply cannot get the image of Bradley raping her daughter out of your mind. I understand, and that is 1000% your right, but don't come and tell me I'm a pedo-apologist for thinking it's a beautiful work of literature. I'm literally a victim of childhood sexual abuse myself. It's offensive. 2 more examples pulled from my actual lived experience. This literally happened to me. You don't want to read A Song of Ice and Fire because you don't like it when there is rape in fiction? That is 1000% right. I get it. But don't come and tell me George R. R. Martin is pro-rape based on nothing but that, or that, once again, I'm pro-pedophilia, especially when you've never read the book. Again, I'm literally a rape victim. This shit is offensive. You don't want to read Lolita because of its, yes, very dark premise. I get it. Again, that is 1000% you're right, but do not come and tell me Nabokov was totally, without the shadow of a doubt, a repressed pedo based on the most superficial reading of his fiction, and then tell me or anyone else I should be put on a watch list for it being one of my favorite novels of all time. Again, I am literally a victim of childhood sexual abuse here. And also, guess what? It's not my fault or my problem. You lack any sort of media literacy. Bonus example. You don't want to read, or I guess reread, Harry Potter because you think J.K. Rowling is the Hitler of children's fiction. Now, I don't personally agree with that assessment in the slightest. Ultimately, and once again, I don't really care about J.K. Rowling as a person. I don't know her. I've never spoken to her, right? I agree with some of her takes. I disagree with some of her takes. Mostly, I'm just tired of J.K. Rowling discourse. But no, as it so happens, I don't think she's the Hitler. Really? Fucking hell. Of children's fiction. I do think, personally, it is a bit on the batshit crazy side of things. There are grown-ass adults who burn their Harry Potter books because they can't deal with the fact Rowling shares spicy takes on Twitter, and who tie themselves into knots trying to prove Harry Potter was, in fact, actually bad all along because it's so transphobic, homophobic, racist, anti-Semitic, what have you, because again, they can't separate Rowling from the books at all. I'm not saying everyone has to separate art from the artist to the degree I do. Like I said, to each their own. You're free to disagree with me, but I don't know, when I see this stuff, I think to myself, maybe being able to do it a teensy bit could be seen as a basic, useful life skill. Just throwing that out there. But so we have book burning. Not that I think it's common either, right? But still, book burning, and Rowling is the Nazi in this metaphor, sure. Like, at least recycle them. It would be more environmentally friendly, at least. And then retroactively demonizing the books, even though you fully enjoyed them before the whole Rowling thing. Look, I'm all for critically revisiting childhood darlings. I did so with His Dark Materials, and I will also be rereading the Harry Potter books in a couple of months. Maybe I won't like them as much, but that's okay. But come on. When I see this stuff, all I can think is, chill the fuck out. That's my visceral reaction. And yet, you know what? If you want to chuck your Harry Potter books in the bin and never buy another J.K. Rowling book, that is, again, 1000% you're right, that I will respect. But do not come and tell me or anyone else that I am transphobic, homophobic, what have you, for not burning my old-house Harry Potter copies and just wanting to revisit the magic of Hogwarts. I will respect other people's reading choices, guided by their own reading ethics. All I ask in return is that mine be respected as well. If you do not want to read something, don't. But don't tell me what I may or may not read, and don't call me evil for just liking a book. This shit has to go both ways. And my very last point when it comes to literary discourse. Anyone is free to not read a book for whatever reason. I fundamentally believe that and have zero issue with it. I do not think anyone is weak, stupid, or a snowflake for not wanting to read a book with difficult content in it, or a book they feel just won't agree with them. Life's too short and there are too many books out there. You don't want to read Lolita? I get it. That is 1000% fine. You don't want to read A Song of Ice and Fire and other such works of contemporary epic fantasy because of the sexual violence that is often in those books? That is, again, 1000% fine, and I will never push against another reader's boundaries on this. However, when you choose not to read a book or watch a movie, play a game, listen to a piece of music, etc., you forfeit your, it's not a question of actual rights, but you know what I mean. You forfeit your right to make an authoritative statement and share an authoritative opinion about said book, movie, piece of music, game, what have you. That is one of my hardest lines in the sand, but I stand by it. You can explain why you don't want to consume this or that piece of media, this or that work of art. Yes, but you do not get to have an opinion about its actual contents. And you certainly don't get to tell someone who has engaged with the work of art or piece of media they are bad for having enjoyed it. The second you tell me, oh, well, I haven't actually read the book or watched the movie, etc., your opinion becomes worthless. That's the rule for me. I'll conclude with 2 concrete examples that kind of cover everything I talked about. I read Blindsight last year. I made a rant review for it if you're interested. I hated it on its own merits, without knowing much of anything about Peter Watts, its author. After I finished reading Blindsight, I did actually do some research on Peter Watts, just out of curiosity, to check up his academic credentials and things like that. I did come across a couple of statements made by Mr. Watts that left me with the feeling I would probably not align super well with him in terms of personal worldview. That being said, I also don't actually care, right? I have no beef with Mr. Watts. I wasn't a super big fan of his book, or the whole shoving a 30 pages bibliography in my novel thing, and if I had to choose a writer to spend an hour chatting with, it wouldn't be him, based on the very little information I have gleaned about him. Although, you know what? I'm not actually 1000% sold on that either, because maybe it would still be worthwhile to have a chat with someone like him. It could be interested. I don't freaking know, right? Because at the end of the day, I don't actually fucking know him as a person. And I don't think about it. I don't lose sleep over it, right? So, like, yes, I hated his book, and have zero interest in reading anything else written by him, based on the blurbs I've perused, but I don't hate him. You know, I wish him the best of luck in his future endeavors. Then there's the Second Apocalypse series, written by R. Scott Bakker, which I have not read, and will never read. Famous last words, am I right? Because from what I've gathered, it will fall into nihilism porn to a certain extent. Well, I mean, it can be read that way. It can be read as very edgy for the sake of it, and as a metric fuck-ton of sexual violence. Even the people who love the series acknowledge this, most of which can be read as entirely gratuitous. Which is too bad, because it also seems like the series has some genuinely interesting bits of world building. But like I said, I'm prioritizing my mental health. Now, as it so happens, I've also read a few spicy takes, and a somewhat, a bit embarrassing blog post exchange written by R. Scott Bakker that may at least partially inform his fiction writing. But that on its own would never be enough to make me go, yeah, no, I'm never reading his books. I'm not going to read his books because it seems, from what I researched, like their contents will not agree with me in the slightest. And that's okay. R. Scott Bakker is also allowed to have his spicy takes, and I'm allowed to disagree with them. And whilst I'm pretty certain the Second Apocalypse would not agree with me, I also accept the fact I cannot hold any real opinion about it as a work of literature because I have not read it. And I would never say people shouldn't read it. I mean, how would I know? I haven't read it. Or that someone is bad for enjoying such a work of fiction. Or that R. Scott Bakker shouldn't be allowed to write the fiction he does because of a few spicy takes. Again, other readers are free to operate differently, although hopefully still within the confines of basic human respect and legality, of course, but that's how I do things when it comes to engaging with works of literature and art more broadly. So that about covers everything I wanted to say on the topics of personal reader idiosyncrasies and personal reading ethics. I hope you found this video informative, given that was very straightforwardly the point of it, and if you want to discuss your own reading ethics or idiosyncrasies, you are more than welcome to do so in the comments down below. And on that final note, I hope you will have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves. Thank you for the continued support. shall see you all, hopefully, reasonably soon, as always, in another video. But until then, bye-bye.